All right. So we're back and we're going to talk about gerontology for a second, which is the study of old age. Um, there, this is a new field, really. I mean, honestly, in the scheme of medical history, gerontology has only been a field for probably, I don't know, 50, maybe 100 years, because not that many people were living into old age. And so it didn't really warrant its own field. And in fact, for a lot of doctors, the assumption was that there was nothing really unusual or special about the last, decades of life compared to other periods of adulthood. Like there just wasn't that interest. Now medical doctors are recognizing that there are specific ways to treat older people that will really help them to maintain their health and their fitness and allow them to stay active longer. Thanks to the baby boomers who kind of see themselves as eternally young, there are more older people who are staying physically active and are, seeing the value of participating in social settings and all the things that are really good for healthy aging. So we're seeing higher rates of that. But we still have to admit that, in the older age, 65 and above, these two last groups, that we're seeing fewer and fewer people as we age across adulthood. We're seeing fewer and fewer people who are meeting the standard for how much aerobic exercise should be happening, meeting the standard for muscle strengthening, meeting the standard for both of those things. I mean, as you get older, there are fewer and fewer people who are really doing those things. So as I said, when we talked about emerging adulthood, and that's the time when people are the most likely to be exercising, if you can set those patterns while you're a young adult and say, you know what, this is worthwhile and this is important for me to continue doing it, it's more likely that you'll do it throughout your lifetime. And I think as we see the baby boomers, the oldest baby boomers right now are probably about 75, I think. They were born in like 1945. So they're probably 75, maybe turning 76 this year. I think we're going to see more and more older people moving into this level of more physical activity and less likely to just abandon it as they age. Because it's really the best way to maintain your mental health, like as far as like cognitive efficiency and stuff like that, is actually to maintain the blood flow really efficiently, and that's through exercise. Now, geriatrics is a medical specialty devoted to the study of aging. One of the things that's kind of tricky is that the average person tends to like their doctor to be a little older than them on average, not always, but on average. And so as you get older, it might become harder and harder to find a doctor who's older than you, right? So older people have to have the ability to learn to trust that a younger person can, in fact, have all the knowledge that's needed to actually treat them really well. You don't have to walk a mile, exactly in my shoes to understand the needs of a person my age, right? Here we have a female patient being seen by a male doctor. He hasn't walked in a lot of the aspects of her life, but she's willing to see him for other things. So hopefully older people can make a transition into being able to accept that a younger doctor might be what they actually need. And a younger doctor who studies geriatrics is clearly a person who's really up on, the special needs of the aging person. In the US, we are experiencing what we call a demographic shift. If you look at the age structure of the US population in 1920, you see that the age groups that are, 35 and less are the base. They're the bulk of the population. And then we get fewer and fewer people going up in age till we have, just these teeny tiny amounts that are, over 70. And that was kind of how our population was for, the 100 years prior to that, right? Today, we're seeing that our population is much more flat or rectangular shaped, where you have more people in the upper ages than you would have ever thought we were going to have. Like it's almost equal across all the different age brackets up until you get to like 70, and then we see a big step down. But we have, really large numbers of people who are over 85 now, where there was hardly anyone 100 years ago who were over 85. So the things that account for this demographic shift is that people are having fewer babies. We've already talked about that. And more people are making it to middle age. They're surviving childbirth. They're surviving war. The things that tend to take the young adults out of the population are less common now. And so they're more likely to make it to middle age, which means they're much more likely to make it to old age. If you can make it to 50, the probability that you'll make it to 80 is way greater than it was when you were 5. Like all this stuff could have happened in the middle that would have made it so you didn't make it to 50. But if you make it to 50, you're probably going to make it to 80 on average. Because of that, we have this more rectangular distribution. We have more people making it to middle age now. The fastest growing group in our population is what we call the centenarians. That's people who are over 100. That's our fastest growing group. It used to be the fastest growing group was the people over 80. Then it was the people over 90. And now it's the people over 100. These are our fastest growing groups. So we really have, a much older population than we did 100 years ago. Now, there's a difference in vitality among people who we would call, let's say, the young old. About 70% of people who are in this 65 and over age bracket that we're talking about right now, about 70% of those people are what we would call young old. They're healthy, they're vigorous, they're involved in their families, they're involved in their communities. The old are probably going to be a little bit older, but even if they aren't, they're in that 20% where they're having health problems or they're having mental problems or they're having social problems. And then the oldest old are going to be the ones who are typically over 85, or they're significantly, having health problems or whatever, because they're dependent on others for everything. They might live in a nursing home or they get hospitalized frequently. And this is only about 10% of people who are over the age of 65. So most people that we're talking about in the age bracket that we're studying right now are what we would call young old, where, yeah, they're old, their hair's gray, these kinds of things. They've got age on them, but they're still living very vigorous and healthy lives. It should be super encouraging that only about 10% of people in the group that we're studying right now are in sort of a convalescent state or a state where they need a lot of help. Now, there are different types of aging. There's primary aging, which are those changes that are universal, like it's going to get you eventually kinds of stuff. Primary aging is irreversible, right? Like, once your hair turns gray, yeah, you can dye it, but you can't make it not be gray anymore. Like it is what it is. It's irreversible. Wrinkles, these guys. Now, can you surgically fix wrinkles or have Botox injected? Yes, but I'm just saying, can you reverse it? No, those things don't actually go away. Primary aging is just normal aging. You might say, not to compare us humans to dogs, but a lot of our dogs' aging is due to just primary things, like it's part of the life cycle. It just is what happens. Whereas secondary aging is much more representative of illnesses, right? Secondary aging is chronic conditions that the person might develop. These are the secondary types of aging are usually going to be due to habits, maybe habits combined with genes that the person carries that makes them more susceptible to the effects of the habits. And then, other kinds of individual variations, people reacting to the same thing, but differently, right? So let's talk a little bit about some of these, secondary aging, these kinds of chronic conditions and illnesses. Cardiovascular disease is an example of a secondary aging. It's any disease that involves the heart and the circulatory system. So on this chart, we've got death rates of people who are over the age of 65 relative to the death rates of people who are under 65. So the y-axis, that line, you can imagine that that's where the death rate is the same, whether you're over 65 or under it. And then anything where the bar extends to the right, which in this case is all of them, means that it's more likely that you would die over the age of 65 of this cause than under the age of 65. So, people who are over the age of 65 are twice as likely to die of accidents or suicide as people who are under 65. If we go over to cancer, a person over the age of 65 is 5 times as likely to die of cancer as somebody who's under 65. So that's how you read this chart. Diabetes, a person over 65 is 7 times as likely to die of diabetes as somebody who's under that. So what I wanted to highlight were the cardiovascular disease causes. And what you'll see is that a person who's over 65 is 8 times as likely to die of a stroke as a person who's under 65 is 9 times as likely to die of heart disease as a person who's under 65, and is 10 times as likely to die of arterial sclerosis, which is a hardening of the arteries, than a person who's under 65. So all of these are examples of cardiovascular diseases that are more common as we age. So we consider cardiovascular disease to be a type of secondary aging because there are a lot of lifestyle factors that go into development of cardiovascular disease. Age does not make cardiovascular disease a certainty. Like, a lot of people will die with completely clear hearts and arteries and never have a stroke. I mean, age alone is not enough to cause cardiovascular disease. Smoking in and of itself is not enough to guarantee the development of cardiovascular disease. Some people smoke their entire lives and never develop cardiovascular disease. Most people who smoke develop it, but not all. Inactivity isn't enough to guarantee the development of cardiovascular disease, although sitting and not getting enough exercise is considered today, the new smoking, right? It's really super harmful. It's not guaranteeing the development of cardiovascular disease. And even the existence of hypertension. When I was a kid, if you had high blood pressure, they acted as though, well, you're just waiting for your heart attack, right? Like it's guaranteed kind of attitude. And now they know that there are people who just dwell with hypertension, have slightly elevated or elevated blood pressure, and it doesn't ever actually cause any further effects. So the best predictor of cardiovascular disease is in fact age, but age by itself is not enough. A 90-year-old is 1,000 times more likely to die of cardiovascular disease than an identical person who's 30 years old. And almost all 90-year-olds have at least one of the following: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and or dementia. Whereas less than half of the people who are age 65 to 89 do. So clearly there's something about advanced age that makes these things more likely, but age alone isn't enough. We do know that if one of the risk factors that I mentioned is present, usually the person has several. So an older person is in fact more likely to smoke. It's something that they probably picked up when they were younger and it was still considered an okay thing to do, and they just never dropped it during the Great American Smokeout, and right? So they're older and they're smoking. And they probably are not exercising at the level that they should. And maybe they are experiencing some hypertension, right? Like, a lot of times if one risk factor is present, usually there are several, and then that makes it really difficult for us to know which one is like the critical one to have the outcome occur. All right, let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll come back in the next segment. We'll talk about selective optimization with compensation.